the extend, it looks like it's pretty doggone sketchy for what we saw this past year, if we're ever going to get sprayed past 2019. Enlist looks like it may have a little brighter future, and that's just what we're seeing right now. I could end it right there, but I'll proceed. Chris, should I keep going? Yeah, maybe. So one of the things we're seeing, and this thing's drawn more and more of an issue all the time, is the PPO resistance. And I don't think we realized how bad we run that into the ground from a resistance standpoint. So Drake Copeland, he's working on a PhD with me, and part of his project is going out and surveying in West Tennessee the PPO resistance and what we're getting into there. And it was pretty striking what we found this last year. He went out randomly these fields, sprayed them with Flexstar when they were small, the ones that survived. He sent off to up at the University of Illinois, and actually he went up there, and that's part of his work, and do what they do with those molecular tests. It's like reading tea leaves to me, but they can tell if it has the gene for Flexstar resistance. And this was pretty striking what he found, just the random survey across West Tennessee. We've lost Flexstar and Blazer and Cobra over the top. These were propping up the Roundup Ready system, right? Roundup Ready is done. We're just not going to be able to use that in West Tennessee anymore. We've been going with Liberty, and we've been pushing it pretty hard. The clock's ticking on it. I think, you know, we're probably going to find resistance on it just in the near future. It'd be shocked if we don't. Much selection pressures we put on that over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We desperately need a new herbicide to go over the top. And that's where the new Auxin herbicides come in, and they can be a big tool. We saw that with both Enlist, Duo this past year in Tennessee, and with either Ingenia or Extendamax. They did a great job controlling a lot of our pigweed. Great new mode of action that can kind of help protect Liberty. This is where we are in Tennessee this past year. This is my best guess where we were. And that's just kind of showing a lot of the farmers, and they almost always figure this out ahead of us, and a lot of you all, because you figured out what isn't working and what is working on a lot bigger scale. But this was kind of the response we had this last year. We had a big embrace of the Extend soybeans in Tennessee. Roughly 60% of our soybeans were Extend soybeans. Liberty Link took up most of the rest. We got a little bit of Roundup Ready and conventional. A lot of that's in Middle Tennessee, where they don't have pigweed near as bad, quite frankly. Extend cotton, as you all know, it really took off in Tennessee this past year. Tennessee, for whatever reason, and I don't know, they've always been a Delta and Pineland state, and as soon as they could go back to it, they did. But we had a pretty good amount of Enlist cotton out there for the first time on a lot of acres. And then we had a little bit of Liberty Link and conventional cotton in the mix. The problem was keeping it in the field with dicamba. And you had to be under a rock somewhere if you didn't see all this happening. So this is the official dicamba-related injury investigations reported to the State Department of Ags. And this isn't just a Mid-South deal. We had no clue what we were doing. I'm beginning to wonder that early on, but I still have a lot of connections to Illinois retailers. I know a number of them. And gosh, by the end of June in Illinois, a lot of them had 15 to 20 drift complaints. A lot of the retailers did. Some had close to 100. Can you imagine? 100 drift complaints against the store. And these folks are highly trained. I'm going to show some data from them in a bit. It's just shocking to me. But even up in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, just wherever you saw it, we had a lot of issues with drift, except what? Southeast. They didn't. We'll get into that in a minute. So, well, as we all know, no farmer really wants to get the government involved, and I don't blame them. So we were asked to just give an estimate on number of acres to try and capture exactly what we were seeing out there. And my best guess for Tennessee was 400,000 acres, and that's essentially 70% of the non-DT soybeans in the state. And some of the counties I was in, it was 100% of them. If they weren't DT, they were drifted on. They showed dicamba injury. So I thought that was actually a pretty generous estimate on my part. That's the guess for that. That's just soybeans, though. That is not the rest of the broadleaf world, and that's probably going to be even a bigger issue next year. The exceptions to the rule were the Southeast, and why? We hear a lot of speculation of that, Alabama and Georgia in particular. I think one of the biggest things is they're not soybean states. The soybeans we have found, if we didn't know it before, we certainly know it now, is probably one of the most sensitive species ever to dicamba. And for them to coexist together with something you can spray dicamba over the top of in the middle of summer is very, very hard to do. Georgia has like 150,000 acres of soybeans. We've got more than that in like Dyer County. So they're not a soybean state, so they don't have that. I can tell you, Stanley Culper does the training there. He does a great job. And one of his big things is, if you're spraying next to a veggie crop and you're spraying dicamba, you're not very smart. And that's great, because you got another option in cotton, right? You got Liberty. You can come down and take your pigweed out with Liberty. So they got an option. We have no option in Extend soybeans. It's not like you can come in and spray Flexstar and you're going to kill them. Option B is the disc down and replant. So in soybeans, it's a lot more cumbersome to make that work. So a lot of the, especially the captains in St. Louis from Monsanto were pointing to a lot of the really good training in the Southeast, and they did do good training. But you can't replicate Stanley Culpepper and put him in every state. I don't know if the world could stand a bunch of Stanley Culpeppers in every state in the Union. My God, I used his slides. So I kind of take offense that I wasn't near as good as him, but clearly the evidence would support I wasn't. We had a lot more drift than Georgia did. I think another thing is just the environment and the timing. You all know what we do here in Mississippi. You all start, March planting soybeans, and you finish in August. We usually start in April, and we'll finish in August. And you're planting over that big, long window, and you're spraying dicamba over that big, long window. It's different with those veggie crops. They're not out there 6, 7, 8 weeks. They're only in harm's way for 2 to 3 weeks. So if you can miss that timing, you're going to miss them. And there may be some combination of factors, or maybe some environment with this Mississippi Valley that we're seeing more inversions or something. I don't know, but I'm confident it's not all just training, like what I've heard. So we had around 26,000 acres of enlist cotton in Tennessee this past year, and what was remarkable to me was the lack of noise with it. Very few drift issues in Tennessee from this. And what got to me, it was the same applicators, using the same sprayers, and we just didn't have near the issues. Now, one of the questions is Enlist Dual less volatile than Genie and Extendamax? I think that's a question we need to look at and see if that has a play here. It may. I can tell you the straight acid of 2,4-D is about 66 times less volatile than the straight acid of dicamba. And a lot of times we're comparing this to Roundup. I hear that this is just like when Roundup came out. Well, that's nonsense. People are rewriting history. I was around then. I worked for a seed company then that happened to sell a lot of corn. We did not have drift like this in the mid-90s when Roundup Ready crops came out. And Roundup is 106 times less volatile at 80 degrees than dicamba. It just doesn't pick up and move. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with that and just how sensitive soybeans are. So my first calls this year came June 6th, about 20 days earlier than last year. And most of it, as you all have seen, was landscape level across huge fields. Again, this was nothing like when Roundup came out. I'd see Roundup drift when I worked in Illinois for Pioneer, and it'd get into the next field. That's what I define as drift. I don't define what we saw in these fields drift. When it moves sections, you're standing in a section, and you can see dicamba entry uniformly across the field as far as you can see. I don't define that as drift. That's just a landscape level redistribution of that herbicide, unlike anything we've seen before. And you almost have to see it to believe it. And a lot of my colleagues in other states were getting their first sample this year, and they were shocked. You really got to see it. But really, the early June calls, we were the Garden of Eden this year as far as growing environment for soybeans, and they came out of it. And soybeans are very forgiving. They will come out of it. But these July drift events were the worst. Number one, we're spraying bigger weeds. It's hotter, and it seemed like to me it just went further. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or just my perception, but it did seem to me. I do know Tom Mueller, my colleague in Knoxville, has got some pretty good data that shows when you're spraying big pigweeds, like what we have here, you're going to see an order of magnitude more volatility from dicamba than you do if you're spraying soil or even brown dead plants. It's kind of amazing. We're finding out a lot of things we should have known before we ever rolled this out, quite frankly. When we go to July, The other thing is multiple drift events. These were the killers. Most of those one-time drift events looked bad. Soybeans shook it off and come on. But when we started getting whacked for the second and third time in some of these fields, that's when you started seeing some issues with some yield loss. Now, this field I stepped in on July 1, those soybeans were planted May 4th. They weren't boot top tall. Whacked twice. This field, I actually got called to 3 times. I got hit 3 times. That's straight cold in the plants. But you can see how it's stunted them down. It's still amazing how much they do yield. But these fields were off 15 to 20%, some more. Again, what's the difference? Well, the difference is the sensitivity. Dicamba, I mean, you can basically about a peanut M&M in a big old 1,000-gallon tank, that's enough to give you that type of injury on soybeans that you're going to see. Roundup, on the other hand, if you remember it on corn, you need a lot bigger slug on it. The problem that we saw this past year, though, in 16, this was really more of an issue for just on soybeans and farmers. We had a lot of farmers fussing at farmers. Well, this past year we had the same thing, but it started getting outside of soybean farmers. We got calls into tobacco country in Middle Tennessee. So this was one of the fields I looked at just south of Nashville. It's 20 acres. You get that cobra-headed leaf on tobacco, you've lost the contract. $10,000 an acre. Not a good thing. When I got called on the 3rd of July to the largest vineyard in the state getting drifted on, I know how to drink wine. Not very good at much else about it. I learned all kinds of things about vineyards. They don't handle dicamba very well, and there's a big issue once they get hit. Timing's everything with them as well. Homeowner calls we got called to. So that sawtooth oak there, that's actually my backyard. I was out, let's see, I've been looking at dicamba injured fields for like 3 weeks. I went in my backyard and started the grill and cracked open a beer, and I sat back and I looked at my tree. Well, hell. And I live in a subdivision. The nearest soybean field to me is a quarter mile away. The whole tree, every tree in the subdivision looked like that. So, and there were some of these folks, I mean, in Jackson, just thousands of dollars worth of landscaping some of these folks had. And you know what? Next year's an election year. These folks donate to political, these folks vote. This is going to be a big issue this next year, I'm afraid. The other thing that's different from when the Roundup Ready era out is social media. My God, this thing took a life of its own in social media. You just got overwhelmed with it. But you look at the end report on getting back to soybeans is what we look on yield. Again, we were the Garden of Eden. Most of them come out of it. I thought most of them would come out of it, quite frankly, just because we had a good growing year. Roughly 20% of the fields, and these are there's just all anecdotal. It's no way to really measure it. Around 20% of the fields, some of the farmers thought they lost maybe 10 to 20% of the yield, some a little bit more on some of those fields that got hit. If you look at long-term metadata, and it's not like this is anything new. We've been looking at dicamba drift on soybeans since the 60s. But if you look at all that data, what we saw this year is pretty much what you'll see. You're going to see some yield loss especially if you hit it R1, R2, you're a lot more likely to see yield loss than if you hit it later or earlier in the season. And the growing environment you have after that plays a huge role on yield. This is, again, just another look at that metadata, but again, in that R1 stage, you just very little visual injury, and you can get 2.5% yield loss. You start looking early vegetative stages when they got a long time to grow out of it, you need a lot of injury to see any kind of yield loss, and then you got to get bad weather. So what were all the causes? I know I had my ideas, so I surveyed my county agents in Tennessee and a bunch of the retailers in Tennessee to get their feel for why were we seeing all these issues. And one of the things I thought going into all this was spray equipment contamination. I thought it'd be by far the biggest issue, and it's really not. Most folks were able to clean it out of the tank pretty good. There were a few folks that had some issues, but for the most part, that wasn't a big deal. Dicamba misapplication, that was in the mix. But again, as hard as that label is to hit, staying inside the wind speeds, keeping the boom down. Still, I thought that was reasonable. The county agents really thought dicamba volatilization was a big part of it, and I think I agree with them. But even the retailers thought it was a good bit. Spraying into temperature inversions, that was part of the mix, but a lot of them kind of thought it was hand in hand with volatilization. You spray dicamba, it picks up as a gas and moves into an inversion overnight. And then the use of illegal dicamba applications. And we got two different guesses here of how much that played. And I don't know if they both can't be right. I'm confident the retailers know how much they sold or how much they lost in sales. Somebody bought it off the internet or whatever. But the devil's in the detail. When was it sprayed? A lot of it, just from my walking fields and talking to farmers, was sprayed early as a burn down at a lot higher rate than what we're doing today or right behind the press wheel. It wasn't the June and July applications that were causing us all the issues. I wanted to compare this to what I was seeing. So the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association, they basically represent all the retailers in Illinois. In Illinois, 70 to 80% of the post applications are made by retailers. A lot of farmers don't even own a sprayer. And so they surveyed them, and I thought it was kind of interesting. Their survey was somewhat similar to what we had as far as what the issues were. Physical drift, spraying into inversions, volatilization of those Ingenium XtendiMax, applicator error, and sprayer contamination. It was somewhat similar. One thing that was probably dissimilar, though, is 89% of them said they didn't believe using old dicamba formulations was part of the reason they had issues in Illinois. And I thought that was interesting. And I believe it because the retailers spray it. They're not going to be spraying lower dollar stuff. That cuts into what they make, right? So that was interesting. This was one of the take-home points to me. Did you see dicamba injury symptoms to non-DT soybeans even when the wind was not blowing toward the field during the time of application? 85% of them saw it drift against the wind. And these are the guys, these are the most trained folks you're going to have. Gosh, Gromart FS, Darren, they've got a simulator, like an airplane. You get in it, and it's like you're in a big John Deere sprayer. And they do different scenarios in there. Wind's picking up, rain's coming. If you run that thing in the ditch, it shakes you up really good. So they do a lot more training than most of our farmers do. And if these folks couldn't keep in the field, it really made me wonder if we could at all. The other thing is if you saw symptoms to non-DT soybeans, even when the product was applied according to the label, what distance did you see it go? A quarter to a half mile was one of the most common responses, and it was pretty confident what I saw this past year and probably what a lot of y'all saw. This was the most telling thing of it, though. Most stated that 50% of the non-DT soybean fields near extend fields they applied dicamba showed dicamba injury. 50%. So it looks, if you look at this data, you look at all the fields I've walked, you look at volatility, it looks like it's in the mix. And we're doing a lot of work on this. Land grants are right now. Tom Mueller, this is one of his setups where he's got these puff sensors. He sets them up, he sprays dicamba out there on an acre, whatever formulation. He puts these puff sensors up there and they can actually detect it picking up as a gas days after application. And this is just one of his studies. This is looking at Clarity, XtendiMax, and Ingenia. And he sprays these first things in the morning, 6 o'clock. So 0 to 6 is basically the morning of spraying. 6 to 12 is that afternoon. Then off to the next 36 hours after that. The pattern in all his studies always looks the same. He sees the most drift the afternoon, or the most volatility of all these formulations, the afternoon of the day he sprays. And it goes down after that. But I've seen some of these where dicamba's picking up 48 hours, even up to 4 days, where you can see some of it picking up as a gas and moving. Industry, whether it's BASF, whether it's Monsanto, and of course all my land grant colleagues, we all agree this data is accurate. We're seeing volatility. The difference is Monsanto and BASF say it's not enough to cause the issues we're seeing. And I think most of my colleagues, and myself included, believe that when you start scaling this up, spraying it over thousands of acres over a few day period, we're not so sure this isn't part of the mix. Not all of it, the reason we're getting this issue, but it's part of the mix. So what are we doing some best management practices? This is what I'm telling my growers. Do not plant, for the love of God, do not plant extend soybeans anywhere near high-value sensitive crops. I don't want to have to go back to that vineyard again, that vineyard owner, and these tobacco guys, some of them, I mean, they learned their lesson this last year. They're just not going to grow it around there. You just can't afford to have it. Use a minimum of 15 gallons per acre. We had a lot of folks using 10. You got to slow down the sprayer at least 12 mile an hour. Go slower, keep the boom as low as possible. And I can't keep that down enough. This is probably one of the biggest problems we have in Tennessee. It's easy when you're writing these labels up, probably in some room in St. Louis or wherever, but in Tennessee, and I imagine a lot in Mississippi, keeping the boom at 24 inches, unless you got somebody following you around with a cutting torch, putting your boom back together, it's just not that easy to do. Nobody's running a sprayer, obviously, that wrote these labels. That's a heck of a thing to do. Now, I know that we got some of these self-adjusting new sprayers coming out, but how many folks can afford those to get those going? And even them aren't perfect. This is going to be one of the big changes. We've got to do a good job documenting everything we do. And with all the lawsuits this stuff's starting to have, just to protect yourself, you've got to document it. One of the big things you need to know is what's in the fields around you. You have to know it going in. So let's talk about education. That's what we do at Tennessee. We're an education outfit. Thank God. I keep saying I'm an educator, not a regulator. So Tennessee, last year, we had 5,523 applicant takers do a 30-minute module on dicamba stewardship. And if I do say so myself, I thought it was pretty good. We ran 13 blog postings on stewardship management. They were accessed 3,600 times. We did 16 in-season YouTube videos on stewardship management. They were viewed 13,500 times. Monsanto and BASF both did a lot of training in Tennessee. We still had all these issues. And then I hear, the captains in St. Louis telling me that increased training is going to fix this issue. I'm not convinced. Now, I'm going to do my best this year, but I'm not convinced this is going to make that big a difference. So, one can follow the label, and we saw it this last year, and still get drift, in my opinion, because Gene and XtenderMax are not zero on volatility. I still think that's part of the mix. I have people that dramatically disagree with me. There is some evidence out of there, especially out of Arkansas, that dicamba can stick to dust and move, and I think wouldn't be at all surprised if we don't see some of that in some places. TGF folks were just here, but clearly fine spray particles can get caught in inversion. He was talking about running those TTIs at 100 psi. For the love of God, don't do that. You're gonna have some fines out of that pressure that will move, I guarantee you. And dicamba can move with runoff water after a heavy rainfall event. And I've seen it in fields, wash down into another field that's non-extend. That's why that's on that label. You're not supposed to spray it within 24 hours of rain. Again, another really hard thing to do on the label. Who's that good of a meteorologist? Next year, well, we're going to have more EPA regulations. We already got them. Number one, additional dicamba training. Everybody's going to have to go through it if you're going to spray it. And I think they've done a bunch of other things, but the other one is you can only spray from dawn to dusk, which I don't think we had many people running headlights when they're spraying, but that's going to be the other thing. The other state regulations, it's going to be a patchwork, folks, out there. There's going to be a lot of different regulations depending on what state you're in. You all heard the stuff going on in Arkansas with their cutoff date, but Indiana's got new regulations. Missouri's going to have June 1 cutoff date in the Boot Hill, July 15th, the rest of the state. North Dakota, good Lord, they got a June 1 cutoff date, or you can't spray it if the day is supposed to get to 85 degrees. And one of the things in North Dakota, you wouldn't think, first of all, I had no idea how many soybeans North Dakota grew, but it's like 10 million acres. They're a big soybean state all of a sudden. But they were dry, and their soybeans didn't come out of it like ours did. It makes a big difference if you're dry. And in Tennessee, I don't know what we're going to do. I kind of feel for the commissioner because there's no win on doing something. But I've heard just today, we may have a cutoff day in May. We may have one in June. We may have one in July. I don't know what we're going to do. But we're going to have, in Tennessee, you're going to have to be a certified pesticide applicator to spray it, and you're going to have to take dicamba training on top of it. A lot of states are going to shorten up the daylight hours that you can spray. There's a lot of things going on. Stiffer fines are out there. So in Tennessee, I think the fines are going to be a lot stiffer, but I know like in Arkansas they were talking about doing it. Other states were as well. I hate being gloom and doom. Scott says I get people all depressed, and then he moves up here and cleans up, right? So, but I just don't, going into this year, I just don't know how it's going to end well. In the Mid-South, we're probably going to be a little better off when it comes to soybeans, because we're going to have fewer dicamba injured soybeans just because most people are going to grow extend, right? Nobody's going to get beat for the third time, and I hear that a lot of places. That can be a little bit of a drawback, because when I start talking to growers, and I've talked to a number of them, they're saying next year I don't have to worry about it because all my neighbors are going to grow extend. Well, not all of them. There'll probably be 20 or 30% that won't, and that really worries me. They'll even be less worried about following the label because the soybeans next door, surely they're extend. Well, those few acres of non-extend are clearly going to be in harm's way. And the rest of the broadleaf world is definitely going to be at risk. And we've got a lot of these homeowners after this past year calibrated to what this looks at. We have a big lawn and garden show at Jackson every year, UT does. And I missed it that year, but Drake was there and Scott was there, and a lot of dicamba injured plants came in for them to look at. So folks are kind of getting used to it. They're starting to, well, why were my tomatoes delayed 3 weeks or 4 weeks before I got a tomato? They're starting to figure this stuff out. But the real thing that I think is going to be the issue is going to be the Midwest. So nearly half the soybean acres in Iowa, Illinois, the I states will be extend. So that means the other half of those acres are going to be in harm's way. So just in Illinois and Indiana, there's 22 million acres of soybeans. 11 million of them will not be dicamba tolerant. The probability that they don't get drifted on from one direction or another is remote. I just have to go on what we've seen this past year. I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see how I am. I just think that's going to probably be the last straw to this technology. So you look at where we are in this Auxin trait regulatory status. For dicamba, the EPA put it on a short leash. They came close to giving it a 1-year leash, which would have been ended this year, but they went ahead and gave it a 2-year. You look at Enlist, they gave it a longer, they gave it the standard, so it's 2022. And it came out of the gate with a lot less issues than what we've seen the last 2 years with Extend. But this was the big take home. This was a presentation Rick Cagwin, director of the EPA, gave actually earlier this year. And what he told to a big veggie meeting over in Savannah was, what we're going to do is look at this next 2 years and see if we see off-site dicamba drift incidents continuing. To what degree are they continuing? Are they getting worse? Are they getting better? And if we determine the frequency of drift events is unacceptable, define that for me, the registration goes away. And unless we can really have a lot better year than what I think we're going to have in the Midwest, I don't see how this is going to improve. And I think there's a real chance that we're going to lose the dicamba label after this year, unless something drastically changes. And it's really a shame, because this technology does help on pigweed greatly. And one of the things it does, at least in Tennessee, it works really well hand in glove with our conservation, especially with our cover crops. We can make a cover crop a lot better weed control tool with this technology, because you can burn down at planting or after planting. We just had a whole bunch of entomologists in here that hate green bridges. Well, I get calls like this all the time. They're planting green, and we're seeing more and more of that from a weed control. It'll keep your entomologist with something to do, right, Angus? So, but this is the kind of the stuff we're looking at, where we're going out and planting into some really heavy residue with a wheat vetch. This is planting date, and Drake showed this earlier, May 5th, and we're burning down either 2 weeks before with Roundup and dicamba, a week before, 2 weeks after, and we start burning down after planting. You got 40 days. First of all, you cut the number of pigweeds that come up by 50%. There's half your struggle taken care of. And then those 50% that do come up, they're delayed 40 days. It gives you a lot of time to get out there and get a timely application of something else on it. Fortunately, this system also works well with Enlist, and that may be what we have and maybe all we have going forward. It also works well with Liberty. So these new technologies really work well, especially with cover crops. We talked about that earlier. I'm more excited about cover crops than I've ever been because I'm beginning to wonder if we're going to have any herbicides between regulation and resistance.